Well, good morning. I told the folks in the first hour that last night when we had the service after the dinner time, I forgot to turn on my microphone. And so I was walking around and talking, and I thought I was doing really great, and nobody could hear me. And so my wife all morning long has been reminding me to turn on my microphone. And so just for her sake and for her peace of mind, yes, it's on. Thank you, dear. Congratulations on your 90th anniversary at Grace Baptist Church. Next year, 2018, will be the 80th anniversary of Our Daily Bread Ministries. It was actually begun in 1938 just across the bridge in Detroit. That's where the ministry started by M.R. DeHaan. And then some years later, it moved to Grand Rapids, where we're currently headquartered. But our very first international office and our very first international outreach was right here in Windsor, Canada. And so we still have a very strong and very meaningful connection from Grand Rapids to here. And we're thankful for the partnership that we've had with your community over the years. And again, when Stan originally contacted me about coming to speak for your special weekend this weekend, it was just a very, very great honor to be invited. So thank you for asking us to come, and we'll just trust the Lord for whoever's going to speak at the next 90 years. I don't know who that'll be. It won't be me, but I'm sure that Grace Baptist Church will still be here and sharing the gospel with the community of Windsor. So for our time this morning in the Scriptures, I'd invite you to turn to John chapter 9. And if you were in the first service, the Czechoslovak service this morning, this is really a continuation of what we saw in the first session with the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. And the reason I say that is because in John chapter 8, right after Jesus rescues this woman who was caught in adultery and who was about to be stoned to death, it says in verse 12, "Again, therefore, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in the darkness, but shall have the light of life." Jesus said, I am the light of the world. And if you'll notice, when Bob was reading the Scriptures to us this morning, in verse 5, Jesus says, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Those are the only two times Jesus ever makes that claim. And they connect these two events together, in which Jesus rescues compassionately a sinful woman and then heals compassionately a man who was born blind. So that's kind of the setting for where we're going to be. In between those two statements, I am the light of the world, Jesus has been engaged in a severe debate with the religious leaders, and they're questioning his birth, they're questioning his parentage, they're questioning his character. And finally, he says to them in verse 58 of chapter 8, before Abraham was, I am. Now, when he says I am, he is taking to himself the name of God that God spoke from the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3 to Moses. It is the name Yahweh, and it was a name that was unspeakable to the Jewish people. They wouldn't even say it out loud. Jesus makes this claim, and the crowd and the religious leaders are so shocked that in verse 59, they pick up stones to throw at him. Remember, chapter 8 began with the religious leaders wanting to stone the sinful woman. Now chapter 8 ends with them wanting to stone Jesus. And that brings us into chapter 9. And as we come into chapter 9, maybe a good place to get us thinking a little bit in preparation for this is to just be reminded that it's easy for us to have different perspectives on different situations. There's an old story that I think originally came out of India many, many years ago of 5 blind men and the elephant. And the fable of 5 blind men and the elephant is that there was an elephant. Obviously, you can't have 5 blind men and an elephant without having an elephant. So you had an elephant, and then they bring these 5 blind men to touch and feel different parts of the elephant. And then they asked, what is an elephant like? And the one who had the tail said, well, an elephant's like a rope. And one who had one of the legs said, well, an elephant's like a tree. And the one who had the trunk said, well, the elephant's like a long, big hose. Now, the reality is that all of them were right. But they had limited perspective. So they didn't see the whole picture because they're blind men. That's the point of the story. The reality, though, is for us, we also have limited perspective. And we don't always see accurately what is right in front of us. And that's exactly what happens in chapter 9 with this blind man. And it's ironic that chapter 9 is a story about how we view people, and it's a blind man who can't view people who is the subject of it. In verse 1, it says, as he, Jesus, passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? Now, immediately we're confronted with the first perspective of this blind man. And the first perspective comes from the disciples. Jesus comes and he encounters this blind man. Now remember, Jesus had been in the temple and he's coming out of the temple, and here's a blind man. It was very common. Blind men actually provided a service to the community in ancient Israel because one of the duties of Judaism was to give alms to the poor. And so, since blind men couldn't work and they couldn't hold down a job and they couldn't do things, what they could do is they could provide a service to the community. And so many times they would sit at the gates of the temple so that when people were coming in or going out, they could do their alms as part of Judaism. Drop a few coins in his bowl. But as this group stops in front of him, he doesn't hear the clatter of coins in his bowl. What he hears instead is this very academic, very intellectual question that's presented in almost a cold and distant and aloof way. And it's very important that we hear it that way because that's how he would have heard it. Remember, he's blind, but he's not deaf. He hears what's going on. He hears what's said. And here's what's going on. Jesus comes and he sees this blind man, and then the disciples look at him, and they look at him like he's a laboratory experiment. They turn him into a theological riddle. They say, who sinned? This man or his parents that he should be born blind? Now, what's interesting about that is to us, in our 21st century ears, it sounds like a stupid question. Who sinned? This man? That he was born blind? Really? It's ridiculous to us. But we don't understand what the rabbis were teaching in the first century. The rabbis were presenting a lot of different ideas that did not come out of the Scriptures, but did impact the thinking of the people. And so what the disciples are asking Jesus is, which one of the other rabbis do you line up with? Who sinned? This man? Well, according to the rabbis, there were 3 different ways that man could have sinned to be born blind. One way to describe it would have been some rabbis were teaching an early kind of form of reincarnation. And so they're asking, did he commit some terrible sin in a past life that caused him to be born blind? Some say, no, that's not it. Some say, maybe he was born blind because of something he's going to do. He hasn't done it yet, but he's going to do it, and it's so rotten that God judged him in advance. Now, when I was a kid in Bible college many years ago, my wife and I had a friend. His name was Lamar, And Lamar told me that every morning when he was a little boy, his dad would wake him up before he went to school, and he would spank him in advance for the stuff he was going to do wrong that day. And you know what Lamar told me? He said, I got my money's worth out of every one of those spankings. He turned into a rebellious child, because if he's going to get spanked for doing stuff wrong, he's going to do as much wrong as he can. So there was the past life view, and then there was what the theologians would call the predestinarian view, that you're being judged in advance. And then some actually taught a prenatal view, that it was possible for an infant in the womb to commit sin. Now, it's hard for me to imagine what kind of stuff they could do in there that would be so terrible that they would be born blind, but that was what some of them taught. So when they say, who sinned, this man? Well, the disciples are saying, which one of the rabbis do you start off with? They are viewing this man as a theological riddle. And the problem with that is, because they are viewing him as a theological riddle, they are not viewing him as a human being. They're not viewing him as a person who was made in the image of God. And that's a problem. The disciples have been with Jesus now for almost 3 years. And being with Jesus almost 3 years, they have seen him interact with the poor. They have seen him heal the sick. They have seen him rescue the demonized. They have seen him feed the hungry multitudes. They have seen Jesus relate to hurting people as hurting people, but they're not there yet. They take a cold and distant view, and instead of seeing this man in his hopelessness and in his isolation and in his pain, they see him as a theological riddle. Okay? So that's the first perspective. And I would suggest to you that we do the same thing. We do the same thing. We see somebody going through hardship, and maybe we're too polite to say it out loud, but we kind of wonder in our minds, I wonder what they did to deserve this. Wonder what God's judging them for. I wonder what's wrong with them. That's the disciples. That's the disciples. Passing judgment on a man with the assumption that this blindness is a direct result of personal sin on his part. Now, Jesus is going to correct that, but we'll come back to that. What we want to see right now is that Jesus does heal the blind man, and Jesus does this on a regular basis. What's so interesting is that blindness, largely due to the unsanitary conditions, blindness was rampant in first century Israel. That's why you see so many blind men in the Bible. And so you have all these blind men, and Jesus heals them. And when we see Jesus heal them, it's going to be a really fascinating way to heal someone. But the reality is that Jesus heals blind men all different kinds of ways. Sometimes he heals them just by speaking to them. Sometimes he heals them by touching them. Sometimes he heals them by spitting on their face, which, by the way, where I come from, that would be rude. But that's what Jesus does. He spits in their face. Jesus had all kinds of ways to heal blind men, and he used all of them, including the one that he'll use with this blind man. But Jesus heals the blind man. Now we need to get the next perspective. And the next perspective comes from the neighbors. Verse 8, the neighbors, therefore, and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? And others were saying, it's him. But still others were saying, no, he kind of looks like him, but he's not really him. And he says, hey, it's me. You know, I'm the guy. It's me. It's me. So you have the neighbors who are viewing him, and you would think that the neighbors who have likely known this man his whole life, They've known he was born blind. They've seen him every day feeling his way along the walls of the temple to come to the gate so that he can sit down and beg, and then at the end of the day to feel his way. They've watched this man. You would think that this would be a moment for them to celebrate. But they don't celebrate. Whereas to the disciples, this man was a theological riddle. To the neighbors, he was a mystery. What's going on with this? I wonder what this must be about. I wonder how this happened. Well, this really can't happen, so maybe he was never blind to begin with. Maybe he was faking it. That might be the answer to the mystery. Or maybe somebody brought him some special medicine that we've never heard of or never known about. Maybe somebody brought in some special medicine. Well, it's a mystery. And it's such a mystery, and it's such an overwhelming mystery, that they can't even decide whether they think it's really him or not. And he keeps saying, it's me. It's me. So they don't know what else to do, so they take the guy to the Pharisees, which is really kind of a bad deal for the guy, because most people who get taken to the Pharisees, it doesn't end well. They are not the nicest people in Jerusalem. So it says, they brought to the Pharisees him who was formerly blind. Now, the way Jesus healed him was he spit in the dirt, he made mud, he wiped it into the guy's eyes. And just looking at it from a totally practical level, the guy's already blind. Now, even if he could get his sight, he wouldn't be able to see because you just packed his eyes with mud. So if anything, it seems like you're just making the situation worse. And Jesus tells him to go to the pool of Siloam. He washed, and he came seeing. That's how the healing took place. So it says in verse 14, now it was a Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. It was a Sabbath. Now, what we know is that according to the way the Jews interpreted the law, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, it was that there can't be any work. There can't be any work on the Sabbath. And I mean, they are super serious about this. A few years ago, I was in Israel. I was leading a study group in Israel, and we were in Jerusalem, and we were staying at the Holiday Inn. Imagine that, the Holiday Inn in Jerusalem. And we were staying there, and I just finished breakfast, and I got on the elevator, and I hit the button for like whatever, the 27th floor, or whatever it was where I was staying. And the doors closed, and it went up one floor, and then it stopped. And the doors opened. I was the only person on the elevator. There was nobody standing out there. The doors closed, then it went up to the third floor. And it stopped, and the doors opened. And there was nobody there. And the doors closed, and it went up to the fourth floor. You know, I'm not exactly the brightest bulb in the pack, but after about 6 or 7 floors, I decided to switch elevators. And because I'm a nice guy, I thought I would help him out, so I got to my room eventually, and I called the front desk. I said, hey, you guys have a broken elevator. That crazy thing was stopping on every single floor. And he could tell by my accent that I was just a knucklehead American, so he very patiently said, sir, the elevator's not broken. It's the Shabbat elevator. It's the Sabbath elevator. That's the Sabbath day when this was happening. And because no work is allowed, you're not even allowed to press the button of the elevator, because that would be considered work. And so they would program one elevator to stop at every floor so that the observant Jew wouldn't have to break the Sabbath by pressing the button. Next time I was a little more careful what elevator I got into. This is how serious it is to not work on the Sabbath day. And here's Jesus making mud, which is considered work. As a matter of fact, On the Sabbath day, the Jews were so meticulous, you weren't even allowed to spit on the Sabbath day, because if you spit downhill and the spit started to run downhill, it was making mud, and therefore you were making mud, and therefore you were breaking the Sabbath. That's how strict they were. But Jesus, in front of a whole crowd of people, intentionally stoops down, spits in the dirt, makes mud, packs it in the guy's eyes. And this is the issue the Pharisees are concerned about. And this is what's so short-sighted about them. They see this man as a problem to be solved. This guy's a problem. And he's a problem because everyone who comes to the temple knows that this guy was born blind, and now he can see. And the means by which he became able to see was by violating the Sabbath. And so now the Pharisees have a job to do. So therefore the Pharisees were asking him how he received his sight. And he said to them, he, doesn't name him, he applied clay to my eyes, and I washed, and I see. One Bible teacher said, it's very interesting, he said, we were made out of the dust of the earth, right? Since Jesus is the creator, he knows where to get the spare parts to fix us with. So he used the dust of the earth to fix somebody made out of the dust of the earth, which is actually very cool. Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. You see the problem? This guy's a problem. But others were saying, how can a man who's a sinner perform such signs? And there was a division among them. Then they said to the blind man again, what do you say about him since he opened your eyes? And he said, he's a prophet. The Jews therefore did not believe it of him that he had been blind and had received sight until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight. So here we have three perspectives so far. The first perspective is that he's a theological riddle, not quite a human being. The second perspective is he's a mystery. We don't know what to do with this. The third perspective is he's a problem. We got to deal with this right now. The most tragic of the perspectives is the parents. My heart goes out to these folks. I mean, can you imagine? In Jewish culture, there was no greater blessing to receive from God than a male child, to carry on the family name, to carry on the family line. It's just a marvelous thing. My wife and I have 5 kids, 4 sons, 1 daughter. So we're 4 times blessed. My daughter would say 5, but she's probably right. We have 4 grandsons and 1 granddaughter. So there are a whole lot of little Crowders running around out there. It carries on the family name. That was really important in that culture, to carry on the family name. So imagine these parents, they wait the 9 months of the pregnancy, and then this little guy is born. But over time, they discover that he can't see. And their greatest joy becomes their greatest heartache. Can you imagine how many times in this child's life, as he grew to be this man who's begging by the gate of the temple, can you imagine how many times they wished and longed and prayed that somehow, some way, he'd be able to see? I mean, isn't that what you would want if it was your child? More than anything else. Lord, if somehow they could see. Somehow. This should be the happiest day of their lives. Should be the happiest day of their lives. But it says, the Pharisees questioned them, saying, is this your son who you say was born blind? See, now they're questioning the parents' integrity. Not only has he been faking it his whole life, you've been helping him. Because everybody wants to be a blind beggar, right? I mean, that's the career path everyone wants. Of course, this kid grew up and he decided, man, the greatest life in the world would be able to be a blind beggar. Wow. Mom, Dad, can you help me with that? I mean, it's so absurd. But the religious leaders are so bent on destroying Jesus that they cannot allow a miracle to be done by someone they're trying to destroy, especially on the Sabbath. His parents answered and said, "We know that this is our son. We know that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He is of age. He shall speak for himself." These parents should be having a party right now. And yet they're being bullied and browbeaten by the religious authorities into not even experiencing the joy of the greatest thing that could ever happen to them as parents. And notice why. It says, his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." To the disciples, he was a theological riddle. To the neighbors, he was a mystery without a solution. To the religious leaders, he was a problem to fix. To the parents, he was a fear to be avoided, a danger to be escaped. It's such a tragic picture for these parents. And my heart goes out to them. We don't understand that because we think, well, if they put him out of the synagogue, that's okay. There's another synagogue down the street. They can just go to that one because that's the way Baptists do it, right? We say, well, there's 15 other Baptist churches within 5 miles of here. If I don't like it, I'll just go to another Baptist church. It didn't work that way in Israel. The way it worked in Israel is if you were removed from the synagogue, it was a large imprint on your life, because being removed from the synagogue meant that you were removed from community life. That meant you had no contact or interaction with community, which meant you couldn't work, which meant you couldn't go to the market and shop. Everything about life was based on community in first century Israel. And when you were driven out of synagogue was the centerpiece of community. When you lost the synagogue, you lost the community. It's a terrifying thing. In a culture based on community, to be driven out of the community and you have to live in isolation is a terrifying thing. They are afraid, and for good reason. And that's all the more tragic. So, we look at this guy, and we feel the weight of the parents. We feel the coldness of the disciples. We feel the animosity of the religious leaders. We feel the confusion of the crowd. We feel all that stuff. But the perspective that matters is the perspective of Jesus. So let's go back to the beginning. "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind?" And Jesus answered, "It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but in order that the works of God might be displayed in him." You're looking too low for answers. You need to lift up your eyes to the hills from whence comes our help. Our help comes from the Lord. Instead of looking at this man like he is the problem completely contained in himself, wonder for a moment what the great God might do through this. Lift your eyes to higher ground. Look with the eyes of the Heavenly Father. Jesus says, "We must work the works of Him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no man can work. While I am in the world," here it is, "I am the light of the world." Same thing He said in chapter 8, verse 12. Now here there's a little play on words that Jesus does. He says, "I must work the works of Him who sent me." Then He sends the man away to the pool of Siloam, and Siloam means sent. So it's sent, send, sent. Jesus doesn't waste anything. He's expressing something here. He's expressing purpose and direction and movement and trajectory. And he's saying there's something going on here that's moving in a direction. And because you can't see, in some ways you're more blind than the blind man is. I'm sending him, just as the Father sent me. And oh, by the way, in John's Gospel, on the later part of it, Jesus says to his disciples, as the Father sent me, right here he says, him who sent me, as the Father sent me, so send I you. This is a missional moment where Jesus acts out what's going to take place in the Great Commission. And he uses a man born blind to do it. Now, what's so interesting about this is, I think sometimes, and those of us who have full access to a Bible, the story you told about Sue and getting the Bible to that guy and everything. I remember the first time I was in Russia, and I was there to train pastors. And I remember that some of these pastors, all they had was like a Gospel of John or a book of Psalms. That was all the Bible they had. And so we raised some money before we went, and we got them a stack of books. And top of the books in Russian, in Cyrillic, was a reference study Bible. And I watched these guys, 27 of them, as we handed these books off to them. And all the books were great, and they liked them. But when they saw the Bible, some of them just opened it and buried their faces in it and started to weep, because they'd never had an entire copy of the Scriptures before. I mean, we take it so much for granted here in North America because we have freedom and we have resources. And we've got stacks of Bibles at home. And here were these guys just unashamedly weeping to receive a full, intact Bible for the very first time. You say, why do you say all that? I say all that because of this. I think because we've had such free access to the Bible, we take it for granted. We take it for granted. We read it without reading it. We have our devotions. We kind of say a chapter a day keeps the devil away, and we do our little Bible reading and all this kind of stuff. But we don't really read. We scan. And one of the great challenges, I was speaking to a pastor's group a couple of years ago, and one of the pastors asked me in a Q&A session, what do you think is one of the biggest challenges facing the church today? And I told him, I think it's we've forgotten how to read the Bible. We've forgotten how to read the Bible. Because we just skim it, and we don't really live with it. We don't really allow it to live with us. We don't dig. We expect that's the pastor's job. Well, it's the pastor's job, but it's our job too. All of us are to be students of the Scriptures. All of us are to learn how to read the Bible. You say, well, why are you telling us all this about a blind man? Here's why. We have 4 Gospels. Each one of the 4 Gospels is written by a different author to a different audience with a different strategy. Okay? Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience, so he quotes the Old Testament over and over and over and over again. Why? Because he's trying to convince these Jewish people that Jesus is Messiah. That's why. Mark is writing to a Roman audience, and so there's a lot of action. You hear the words immediately and straight away, and after that, the action just keeps moving all the time. Why? Because Romans were people of action, and they didn't have time to sit around and wait. Luke writes to a Greek audience. Greeks were all about learning and education, so you get more of Jesus' teaching, more of his parables in Luke's gospel. See? John's gospel is written to a more universal audience, but he tells us in John chapter 20, these things have I written that you might believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That's why I've written this. He tells us what his mission is. What's interesting is when you read carefully in the Gospel of John, Out of all of the miracles that Jesus did, and this is one of them, but out of all the miracles that Jesus did, John only records 7. I mean, Mark has more than that in chapter 1 almost. John only records 7 miracles. But you know what he does? He does it very strategically. Each one of those miracles is connected to a claim that Jesus makes for himself. And so Jesus makes a claim for himself, and then he proves it's true by doing a miracle. So Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. And he proves it by feeding a multitude of people from a kid's sack lunch. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. And he proves it by raising Lazarus from the dead. See? This is John's strategy to convince us that Jesus is the Son of God. And here, the miracle and what God is doing through the miracle is that Jesus is claiming, I am the light of the world, and he proves it by bringing light to the darkened eyes of a man who was born blind. See, this is John convincing us, pleading with us to see the truth of who Jesus is. And that's the larger lesson of what God is doing through this event. Jesus says, this was done in order that the works of God might be displayed on him. And part of that work was Jesus to prove that he was the light of the world by healing a blind man. So that people 2,000 years later could read the Gospel of John and see evidence that demands a response. Because the ultimate perspective is, who do you think Jesus is? That's the ultimate question. That's the ultimate question. C.S. Lewis rightly said, anything less than saying he is God is insufficient. Because either he was who he claimed to be, Lord of all, or he was a liar, or he was a lunatic. Because nobody makes the claims that Jesus made if he's in his right mind, unless he is just a deceiver of the first order. Either Jesus was Lord of all, or he was a liar, or he was a lunatic. And so Lewis says, let's not have any of this, he was a good moral teacher. Because if he was not the Son of God, he was not a good moral teacher, he was a liar. Or he was a lunatic. The question before the disciples, the question before the crowd, the question before the Pharisees, the question before the parents, the question before the blind man is not what's your perspective of the blind man, it's what's your perspective of Jesus. And the blind man, the one who couldn't see, is the one who gets it right. Because in verse 35, Jesus heard that they had put him, the formerly blind man, out of the synagogue. And finding him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, get this, you have both seen him, and he is the one who's talking to you. And this once blind man sees perfectly and says, Lord, I believe. Lord, I believe. That's the perspective that John is driving for. How we view others is part of our journey, and how we view others may or may not reflect the heart of our Heavenly Father, but how we view Jesus is the eternal issue. And that is what we're called to. That is what we are challenged by John to believe. That the one who claimed to be the light of the world really is, after all. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for the Scriptures. Thank you that in them we don't just find interesting stories or challenging information, but in them we discover the truth about you and the truth about Christ and the truth about our rescue and the truth about eternal life. Father, open our eyes that we might see wonderful things from you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Stevie Wonder, Hitsville, USA. I think you might know of that place. Do you know the doctor said to the mother, teach him to weave baskets so he has some usefulness in this world? Oh, how sometimes we are limited. We need to see that around us as well, what God can do when we give it over to him. May we always have free trade, because you're welcome on this side of the border anytime. Amen? Amen. Let's stand, yes. Let's stand as we sing 2 verses of number 422. Give of your best to the Master. May God bless and keep you. May his face shine upon you, and may his face shine through you. And the grace that has been given and received by you, will you offer it to one another? For such is the kingdom of God. May God bless and keep you. Amen? Amen. And amen. Peace be with you.